All right. So it's 12 o'clock on the dot. Um, I'll go ahead and thank you all for uh, showing up or tuning in, rather, to our Zoom IEI BEEP seminar presentation. For those that aren't really familiar with the Institute for Economic Inquiry, basically we are a center on campus that aims to have conversations about institutions that promote human flourishing, and most of our programming, all of our programming is kind of geared toward that, especially this one that we're about to have today with Dr. Ryan Yonk, who is the undergraduate program director for the North Dakota State University Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise. He's also a lecturer of economics for the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics at that university. He is extremely prolific, writing on a variety of topics. He's authored and edited several books ranging from environmental and energy policy to taxes and political systems. He does a wonderful job of intersecting political science and economics, better than most. We were supposed to host a two-day colloquium this weekend, but unfortunately, due to the pandemic or the crisis, we've had to postpone it, hopefully to sometime this year, hopefully in the fall. If not, we'll do something in the spring. So we're all uncertain right now, but hopefully we will get that program together. We're excited to have him direct that colloquium. So and that colloquium is based on some of the topics I imagine he will touch upon today with his presentation. So we're gonna run the talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then have questions at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to just type them into the chat, and Dr. Yonk can probably see some of the chat responses. If not, we can kind of have a starting point for questions at the end with those questions that are typed up. But okay, enough from me. With your spirit fingers, help me welcome Dr. Ryan Yonk. So take it away.
I'm not sure that those are spirit fingers. I think those are jazz hands, my friend.
Oh, those are jazz hands.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction. Apparently, if you listen to all that, I clearly have a severe case of academic ADHD, and any random topic that comes up inside politics, public policy, and economics, I'm likely to try to write on. And we're going to talk a little bit for about the next 45 minutes or so about Native American economic development. But I want to start with a story, because I, like so many of the things I've done in my career, I fell backwards into working with some Native American reservation groups here in Utah after we got a random email. So for many of you know this, I worked with Dr. Randy Simmons, and I also worked with the doctors Thomases. I'll probably refer to them as Michael and Deanna, because I just won't be able to remember to call them anything other than that, at Utah State. And about 10 years ago now, I can't believe it's been 10 years ago, we got an email that was clearly sent out by a woman named Dorothy, who was the economic development director for the Aneth chapter of the Navajo Nation. And she sent out this, it read and looked like a spam email, I think, to every economics department, every economist listed on a website for a university in Utah, asking for help to do economic development in Aneth, in the Aneth chapter. And so we're reading this email. Dr. Simmons and I are talking a little bit about things that we're interested in, questions we want to answer. We've been working on local government issues for a long time, and we say, you know, let's give Dorothy a call and see what it is they're looking for. And so we get on the phone with Dorothy, and Dorothy is an incredible woman who's done some great things for business development in Aneth. Of course, because she was both competent and successful, she's moved on to bigger and better positions, as is often something we're going to see that happens, particularly in places like Aneth. And so we sit down to talk with her. And as we're chatting, two things become rapidly apparent. One is things are a disaster in Aneth, Utah. And I'm going to tell you that today, things are not a whole lot better. And we're going to talk about a bunch of things that we tried to do to help. And by and large, we failed. And we failed for a list of reasons, I think, that are going to become pretty apparent as we talk through these things. And the second thing that we discovered quickly was that there was a perception of, if we could just figure out how to build the right thing, if we could just find the right industry that could come to Aneth, Utah, somehow all of the economic development problems would get solved. I started to call it the field of dreams perspective on economic development. And it pervades rural economic development, whether it's on reservation lands or simply in rural places. That if we could just, if we could just get a Family Dollar or a Walmart or a light manufacturing plant here in our community, suddenly everything would be better. And that perspective, as we chatted with her, it also became very clear that no one else responded to her email. That apparently we were the only two guys in the state crazy enough to decide, let's jump in and see what we can figure out in this part of southern Utah. And as we're chatting with her, what she really wants from us is an economic development plan, because if they write an economic development plan, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Department of Agriculture will give them a sizable grant to expand their business development offices, which they then think they can lease out to draw in basically a phone support company. This is what they think is going to happen, and they really just need an economic development plan as a checkbox to get through this. And so we're talking to her and we say, we're in. We want to help. We have some resources. We'll help raise some money from folks, but you're going to discover quickly that we don't do typical economic development. We started by saying we weren't going to write her a plan. We ended up writing a plan because turns out, like her, we like money from the United States Department of Agriculture, and that was the only way they were going to send it so that we could work on it. But we said, our own belief is that the issue going on in Aneth isn't that there's not a call center, or there's not a Family Dollar, or there's not a Walmart. It's that somehow the link has been broken between entrepreneurs and their ability to actually engage in business. And as we're talking to her, she starts to get fairly excited. She's also very frustrated because we're telling her we're not going to do any of the things that she wants done. And so she starts to get excited. We say, what we're really interested in is, how do we foster and help a place like the Aneth chapter? And eventually we're going to start to talk about a town called Montezuma Creek, because that becomes the focus of a bunch of the work that I've done on trying to understand why there wasn't entrepreneurship happening in this area. And they say what we're interested in is what's going on in Montezuma Creek in the Aneth chapter that's stopping economic development from happening through entrepreneurship. So we start with a belief tied into a whole bunch of the literature on entrepreneurship and economic development, that if you're going to have solid economic development, you're going to have entrepreneurs acting, that you're not going to have a centrally planned response that somehow creates economic development. That no matter how many times someone runs a multiplier study, those multiplier studies, even if they're remotely correct, are tied back to an entrepreneur acting. And I don't believe in the multiplier studies, and I get yelled at all the time because I work in lots of rural development questions, and there's nothing rural development loves more than a good multiplier study, because it demonstrates that we did something. I mean, I can run a multiplier study with the best of them and say that the program we ran in Aneth, you betcha, had real high multipliers. But it didn't end up actually creating, it didn't end up creating entrepreneurs that then created jobs. And so our discussion with her was that what was stopping entrepreneurs from happening in this area? What was stopping entrepreneurship from going on? And one of the first things we ended up doing was we decided we had to go to Aneth. We had to go to Montezuma Creek and spend some time. It was a great hardship for us to want to go to southern Utah, to the desert, into the Red Rock country. It's a beautiful place. Here in a few minutes, I'll put up some slides of some pictures of these places for folks to be able to see, supposing that the Zoom screen share thing works, which it does about half the time for me. And so we go down to Aneth, and as we're pulling into town, as we're pulling into Montezuma Creek, we see something immediately, because the story we'd been told by Dorothy, by all the sort of studies that had been done on economic development in Aneth already in that chapter area, was that there was almost no business going on in Aneth. And as we're pulling into town, we notice something immediately. And the thing we notice is that, in fact, as we're pulling in, there's a set of vans clustered around the intersection of two state highways, and there's probably 40 people gathered around the vans. And as we're talking to Dorothy, as we're pulling in to head towards we get into our meeting, and we're asking her about what that is, and she starts to tell us a story about the burrito people. And I hate to describe them that way, but that's the description she gives us. And it turns out that what was happening at that intersection every day was a group of primarily women had come together and created a place where folks could come and purchase lunch. And they were selling homemade burritos, completely off the grid, out of the back of this set of minivans. And as we're talking to Dorothy, we start then to get a sense of what's happening. Because it turns out it's not that there's no entrepreneurship going on in Montezuma Creek. It's not that it's just not happening, but there's something that's keeping it from really both flourishing and existing in sort of the standard established market that then allows places to grow and to build capital that can in turn be invested in the community. And as we're talking, and of course, the first thing we have to do is we go and buy lunch there, because we're convinced these are going to be the greatest burritos we will ever have. Incidentally, we were correct. They are among the best burritos on the side of the road that you could find. And that discussion then leads us to wanting to dig in. And so part of what we do is we work with the business development folks in Aneth to create both a program for trying to understand what would incentivize more entrepreneurial activities like this, but also what is preventing these sorts of things from happening. Apparently we've been Zoom bombed. I haven't had that happen just yet. So as we're talking about these sorts of things, we start to put together really a two-part research agenda. The first part, and the part that I'm going to spend most of today talking about, is sort of a deep dive into what is preventing large-scale entrepreneurial activity from happening in places like Montezuma Creek. And then the second part was the development of a program and a training opportunity for folks that were living in Montezuma Creek on the reservation to try to develop some entrepreneurial skills. The program for developing entrepreneurial skills was based largely on a program that was called the SEED program at Utah State University, that was originally established by Chris Fossen and a few others. And essentially what it does was provided both formal training and then mentorship in building businesses. Parts of that program are still active in Montezuma Creek and Aneth with some success. And there have been a few businesses started, but it turned out that program ended up facing some severe problems that emerged from the other research that we did. Because we're looking around in Aneth, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen share if I can make it work, because what I want to show us is some PowerPoint slides that really sort of, if I can make this all work, about the Navajo Nation. So there's some things that we'll need to understand. And apparently I drew a red line on the slide and I don't know how to get rid of it, so we have a red line. So as you can see, the Navajo Nation is a large reservation in the Western United States. It covers parts of 4 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. The part that we're dealing with is this part that's sort of right at the corner of the Four Corners area. And it's beautiful country, but the Navajo Nation faces some serious problems. So typically its unemployment rate hovers right around 50%. That's probably jumped dramatically in the last couple of weeks, but it tends to hover right around in that area. It has similar numbers that are living below the national poverty line across. Around a quarter of households have incomes that are under $10,000. And most significantly, when you compare new business starts and then total business activity inside the reservation with the counties that it borders. So if you look at counties that the reservation touches that are very similar in geography, even in demography, new business starts and the total business activity that's going on in those communities lags. And it lags fairly dramatically. And one of the things we in the beginning had a real hard time understanding was why this was the case, given that this covers almost 27,000 square miles in the Western United States, how there was this marked difference between rural areas with similar resource endowments and opportunities, how it lagged across the entirety of that. And one of the first observations that we made is we started to hold some discussion. I won't call them focus groups because they weren't that organized. They were us in a room with some folks in Montezuma Creek. And as we had these discussions, one of the things they kept describing something known as border town, that they called border towns, that all of their shopping activity were happening in what they call border towns. These are places like Farmington, New Mexico, Blanding, Utah, places that are adjacent to the reservation, but outside, and we're not operating on reservation land. And so many folks living on the Navajo Nation have in order to do basic daily shopping, so things like grocery shopping or a trip to Walmart, they were driving a couple of hours to a border town where these opportunities were. And so one of the questions that came up over and over again is, okay, it makes some sense to us why there's not a Walmart necessarily in a number of places on the reservation, but why are there no small grocery stores or convenience stores outside of Window Rock, which is the capital? Why is there not a greater distribution? And part of what started to emerge pretty quickly was that the institutions that existed inside on reservation land were markedly different than those that existed in the areas that they would call the border communities to them. And so when you wanted to start a business in Montezuma Creek, for example, the institutions that you faced in doing that were completely different than the institutions at a small town about 15 minutes away called Bluff, Utah. The institutions were entirely different between the two towns. The two towns are fundamentally similar. They have similar geography. They're of similar size. In actuality, their history is fairly similar up until the 1950s, when there's this divergence into BIA management and greater reservation control in Montezuma Creek. But these two towns end up with radically different institutions. And so the story that we started to see, and one of the things that started to become sort of blatantly apparent, is that many of the assumptions that have been used in trying to understand the problems of economic development, particularly on the Navajo Nation, there have been everything from problems of resource endowment, infrastructure issues, to cultural claims about cultural differences. All of these has been advanced as potential explanations for the difference in development, but there hadn't been a large-scale look at the institutions that were operating on reservation land versus non-reservation land. And so we started to get a hint in those early meetings that this was the case. And there was one particular interaction that helped us get this sense. So while we were down in Montezuma Creek visiting with folks, we started to talk to everybody that was operating sort of in the, I hate to call it the black market, so I'll call it the gray market. I'm not certain that it's actually illegal what was going on, but it certainly wasn't fully endorsed and operating in any way that could be traced, or that was fundamentally sort of the standard way we think of business. As we were meeting with these people, we ended up doing an interview. And I am greatly saddened that I didn't actually get to do the interview. I only got to read the transcript and see some of the photographs, but some of the researchers that worked for us, these were students primarily that were out doing lots of these things, met with a woman named Misty, who lived right on the border of Montezuma Creek. And Misty is sort of the quintessential serial entrepreneur. But Misty's, you wouldn't look at Misty and predict that she's going to be running 4 of the most successful sort of quasi black market businesses in Montezuma Creek. So Misty, as we're talking to her, she's explaining, and we're asking, well, what are the issues that surrounds? And she just sort of looks at us quizzically and says, what do you mean? What are the issues? What things are preventing you from doing more? She says, well, I don't know, I just find a way around all these different rules. And as the interview went on, it started to become apparent that part of what was making it possible for Misty to function was she had a complete and total lack of interest in following any of the formal institutions that existed on the reservation. And in fact, at one point, part of her property actually existed off the reservation. And so all of her business was essentially being conducted on that little piece of property as things developed. And as we're talking with her, she's increasingly interested in, it becomes increasingly apparent to us that part of what's happening and part of what's going on is she's identified what the rules are. She can tell us what the rules are to operate on the reservation. She's just chosen not to follow any of them. And the more we talk to folks like Misty, folks like the burrito people that were making and selling, what became increasingly clear was that the only way they were functioning at all was by simply ignoring the regulations and operating essentially outside of the formal law. And as we dug in, it became pretty clear because it turns out formal institutions matter. Now, as Randy and I were sitting around, the moment we have this sort of revelation, we look at each other and you can tell both of us are thinking, oh, good Lord, we're the dumbest people on the planet. We're a pair of folks that study public choice economics. We're political scientists by training. We lecture all the time about how institutions matter and how important they are. And this one piece is sitting there in front of us, and it takes Misty explaining that the reason why she doesn't deal with the Navajo Nation's regulatory process is that the institutions are onerous and they probably wouldn't license her because it turns out she's not a member of the Navajo Nation. She's not been formally registered. And so all of those institutions are going to add up to make it impossible for her to function. And so she chooses to ignore them. And so as we start to think about this, suddenly now a more interesting, from an academic standpoint, research project starts to emerge. And that is, all right, so let's look at the formal institutions that are in place and that folks should be following. We know some of them don't follow them, and so there is still some business activity going on. But what do the formal institutions look like? And could this provide an explanation for some of the difference between what's going on inside the reservation and in the border communities? And we end up focusing on three sets of formal institutions. The first are regulatory institutions, primarily regulations that have to do with business registration and formation. The second are property rights, so the ability to actually build a actual place to do business. If those property rights are secure, can you get access to property to build something? And then the third are institutions that surround access to capital, both financial and physical. And as we dig into these sorts of things, we get a little bit more formal, and we start to draw from the wider literature. Lots of this is from Hernando de Soto and others in the same vein about the sort of institutions that lead to relative prosperity even among sort of the lesser developed places. And so part of what we start to study are, what do the property rights look like on the Navajo Nation compared to the communities that surround it? What is the access to private property look like? And in this case, we're talking about physical property. Can you actually get access to build a place of business and to use it? And then it's access to capital. The first is collateral availability. Turns out, if you read De Soto, one of the issues is that if you have not well secured property rights, you can't capitalize things like loans. And so the availability of collateral for loans becomes important in the lending. But beyond that, there's also the actual physical proximity to banks. Are there banks that exist inside these communities? Can you get to them? Are you able to actually engage? And then we look at the relative ease of business registration and its availability. Can you actually get a business registered easily? And to look at this, we end up picking two towns. The first is Montezuma Creek, Utah. Montezuma Creek is a reservation town inside the Navajo Nation. It's the town where we ended up spending a significant amount of time talking with folks. This was the town that wanted help with economic development. They are the ones that came to us. They're inside the Annis Chapter House, which is a political subdivision of the Navajo Nation. And if you look on the map, you can sort of see where it's located. This will give you a good sense of sort of where in Utah it is. So we're located in the extreme southwest corner. And so we use Montezuma Creek as our first example. And what we're going to do is conduct a comparative case study between Montezuma Creek and a similar community that exists off the reservation, looking specifically at the institutional arrangements. So you can see here, here's what Montezuma Creek looks like from a satellite image. And apparently I didn't crop it well enough so you can see the other Wikipedia pages I had open to pull images from. But as you can see, Montezuma Creek, there's only this one little core area where you can see any real development, and the rest is pretty dispersed. What you see right above the red wording of Montezuma Creek, if you cross the highway and you go up from there, that's a BIA housing development that the Bureau of Indian Affairs with the Department of Housing and Urban Development built inside Montezuma Creek as a way to create housing. But there's very little private development going on, and the area right around the red text is the set of Bureau of Indian Affairs, a Mormon church is there, built in the same area, as well as the Economic Development Office that we had. And they've now also built a new community health clinic, which is by far the best looking building in all of Montezuma Creek. But what you don't see is any real business activity and development going on, and that occurs for good reason. So as we look at this, so here's just an image of what the area around Montezuma Creek looks like. Unfortunately, here's a picture that got pixelated as it blew up. But what you can see there is there's this weird mixed use that's going on, and it turns out that none of the structures in this picture are actually permitted. None of them have secure property rights in terms of their ability to continue to exist. They're there, and Navajo Nation isn't going to remove them. But for example, you could not collateralize most of those things against a loan. Here's the Business Development Office. And one of the things that you notice immediately is that the buildings that are the best buildings in town, that are the best maintained, are either belong to U.S. federal agencies or they're entities of the Navajo Nation itself. Okay. So for comparison, we wanted to identify a similarly sized communities. Now, Montezuma Creek, I refer to it as a town. It's technically a census designated place, meaning that it's an area the census can identify, but it doesn't necessarily have the formal status that a similar town might have. And so we likewise wanted to find an area off the reservation that had a similar identity and a similar function that didn't necessarily have that had that same level of informality in how it operated. And so there's a small town, there's a small area, small CPD, about 15 miles from Montezuma Creek, known as Bluff, Utah, a place that if you've ever driven through southern Utah, lots of folks stop at Bluff because it's a pretty place. And here you can see this is what when you look at the Google sort of maps satellite view, Bluff looks like. Now, Montezuma Creek and Bluff have within, at the time we were doing our study, they were within about 20 residents of each other. They were in the 350-ish residents. But what you see pretty quickly when you look at Bluff, so it's similar size, it's located 15 miles apart. It doesn't have a city government that's able to get direct transfers. So it's not getting those sorts of things. It's not a separate taxing entity. It exists just inside San Juan County, Utah. It's able to collect a little bit of sales tax that it gets back from the county at this time. But you quickly see lots and lots of property that has been developed across Bluff. And unlike this, no matter how far I zoomed in on Montezuma Creek, Google didn't identify any businesses that were active in the community. And that's for good reason. there aren't formal businesses other than a single gas station that operates in Montezuma Creek at this time. But here we see a number, and if we go in even further, we would see even more business activity happening. And again, here's outside of Bluff. This is one of Bluff's favorite their big claims to fame, or is this rock formation. I own a magnet. You can buy a coffee mug with this emblazoned on it, probably a t-shirt if you want that at one of the little places as well. And what you can see here is this is just off of the highway. We're not seeing like high scale development, but what we are seeing is a number of properties that if you dig in very deep they're individually held, and the rights to them are secure and they can be collateralized. So why did we dig into all of this? Well, partly because we were interested in saying, okay, so what if we know what's going on in what's going on in Bluff, Utah. We're relatively, we can walk through the process of what entrepreneurship looks like, what it would look like for an entrepreneur in Bluff. Is it easy to start a business in Bluff? In the sense that there aren't a lot of regulatory hangups? Absolutely. In fact, in this time, you technically had to have a business license from San Juan County. 5 years ago, they eliminated all business licenses in the unincorporated area, even reducing the barrier further. But at the time, their preference was that you fill out a short online form. Basically, you register what the business is and you pay a fee and you have a business license. On the flip side, in Montezuma Creek, the process of getting a business license required a physical trip to the business licensing department. And for a good chunk of the year, that was in Window Rock, a couple of hours away from Montezuma Creek itself. And you had to have a business plan, a formal set of organizations. You had to be formally registered with both the Navajo Nation and the US federal government. And all of that was before you could be issued a license to operate legally inside Montezuma Creek. Well, it turns out this process ends up being onerous and causing a lot of folks to be unable. And in fact, one of the discussions we had was with an entrepreneur based out of Blanding, Utah, who saw a potential opportunity in Montezuma Creek for a small, basically like convenience grocery store. But he identified a couple of reasons why he had just never opened. He owned a number of these across the rural parts. And the two big ones were, he did not believe he would actually get a business license from the Navajo Nation because he was not Navajo. And there's a requirement that for most businesses, they be at least 50% Navajo owned. And he was not convinced, even if he brought in a Navajo partner, that it would get through the process in Window Rock. And the second was that he couldn't identify anywhere where he could lease with any expectation that the lease would be secure inside Montezuma Creek to actually put the store in and build a business with any planning. And so those restrictions kept keeping him from wanting to engage. As we talked to the burrito people and some of the folks that were operating in the gray market that were citizens of the Navajo Nation, they identified these similar restrictions. In fact, most of them, when we asked them about the business license process, the most common response we got was they would roll their eyes and wave their hands and tell us they had no idea how to go through the process. And the more we dug into the process, we weren't surprised by that. In fact, if you go to the website today for business development, I don't know how many hours it would take me to dig through that process, but it would be lengthy, and it would almost certainly require a trip at least into the office at Montezuma Creek to get the paperwork processed. Now, we focused on so I focused on this part a little bit more than some of the other questions, because there are also issues about property rights and their security. The ability to actually get access to property on the reservation is is a process that you have to navigate both through the Navajo Nation, but also through the US federal government, because it's holding that property in trust for the Navajo. And unfortunately, what holding in trust has meant when the US federal government is involved in Native American situations are preventing anything useful from happening on that land, and preventing them from using it in any functional way. And BIA doesn't appreciate it when I describe their mandate that way, but in function, that's what they've done for the last 100 years in this process. Is what was meant to be held in trust and eventually transferred will never be transferred, and essentially just makes every decision about property inside the reservation one where a federal agency has to engage with it directly. And so there's an entire multi-step process to first get the Navajo Nation approval to request this from the US federal government, the BIA primarily. Beyond that, some of the other things that came up quickly was that Bluff, this little tiny town, has a credit union in it. We were surprised by this. We never would have guessed this. It's a very small branch, but it has a physical location. At the time we were doing this research, Montezuma Creek didn't even have an ATM within the boundaries. The closest ATM was in Bluff, and you would have to drive there. There has since been one installed by the same credit union that's in Bluff, inside the border of Montezuma Creek. But there is no actual banking available inside the community, meaning that at a minimum, you have to travel the 15 miles or so to Bluff to engage with banking, and primarily banking would have to be done in Blanding, which is about an hour away. Beyond that, establishing a bank account due to problems with address consistency, and access to what are sort of the traditional things that you need when you go to create a bank account, those are exacerbated on the reservation, in part because of the institutions that exist there. The other things that we quickly became clear was there were a number of entrepreneurs that wanted to get loans, but they could not identify any collateralizable property in order to get loans. So the only source of lending that they had ready access to was through BIA programs or Navajo Nation programs that had the same sort of regulatory approach as business registration, which is multi-step, and it all has to be done in person. Now, this whole project eventually would go on, and much better and more detailed work has been done on this by Jordan Lofthouse, who just finished his doctoral work at George Mason, and who will go on to write many better and more interesting things about this than I will. But one of the things that he quickly came to recognize was that these problems existed not just in our little example in Anna, but they were problems that existed across the Native American reservation system. And in large part, the creation of the institutions that are problematic are a direct result of federal intervention and the crafting of the regulatory environment that the tribes have to respond to in order to meet the federal obligations. So with that, I've gone for about 45 minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. So thank you for letting me go. I will say I hate doing these presentations by Zoom. I much prefer to be able to see how people are responding and if I'm making any sense. So if I didn't make sense, ask all sorts of questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I have a question about property.
Are you there, Micah? I can't hear you, Micah.
Yeah, I missed a little bit of the property rights talk. You were talking about how it's different. How is it different again? Could you explain that again?
So Native American, reservations which were set aside by the U.S. federal government starting in the 1850s all the way through the current era, the land on the reservation is held in trust by the U.S. federal government for the Native American tribes. The tribal government has some authority over those lands, but those lands can't be transferred to individuals directly. They end up being held in trust, and what you can typically get is only a lease on those lands. Beyond that, even where private property has existed on some reservations, the U.S. The system that developed was that you can't transfer divided shares, and so if it was held privately by 3 generations ago, it is now collectively held by all the heirs to that person, which in function means that it is not held privately. It ends up being in a limbo state where there might be 300 or 400 potential owners over a parcel of property, which makes it almost impossible to transfer. And so even where property might technically be private, the institutions don't allow that property to be easily transferred to single individuals. Basically, you end up with group ownership over even private property inside reservation boundaries. But the much larger issue is the holding in trust of land by the U.S. federal government, working with the tribe, that prevents it from actually being owned by individuals. And so the property rights are relatively insecure.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you expect that the current coronavirus epidemic will hinder entrepreneurship and business development on Native American lands, or is there already a sufficient amount of red tape in place in terms of getting business started that there's not necessarily going to be any sort of measurable impact?
No, there will almost certainly be a measurable impact, in part because lots of what happens on Native American lands is tied to the border areas, and so lots of that spillover is happening. And so the best advice that we ended up giving, the actual policy advice we ended up giving to entrepreneurs was, and I'm not sure I can ever step foot back on the Navajo reservation if I say this out loud, but I'm going to say it anyway, was ignore the Navajo registration and get a San Juan County business license and just operate. And so lots of those that are on sort of the borderland had been using and began to use that strategy, and so they'll be impacted fairly dramatically by it. The other part to it is that for lots of these lands, even though there's not a lot of economic development going on, the single largest area sort of sector is tourism. Even though it's not abundant, it's not robust, but there are still folks that come through the area that do work with these sort of gray market businesses, and those will be pretty dramatically affected by the recent coronavirus. So I would expect that it actually it will probably be worse on the Navajo Nation than in similar places that are on its border.
Thank you.
Brian, this is Taylor Keene with the Institute. I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more about the gray markets. I know that in a lot of the states that are concurrent with tribal jurisdictions, that things like medicinal marijuana have become a huge part of the black market economy here, and we can choose to ignore it or we can look to analyze it. Was there some of that in the gray markets that you were describing?
So lots of this work was done before in terms of the sort of marijuana legalization that went on. A lot of this research was done before that, but I would expect that is absolutely going on. It's not happening necessarily in Montezuma Creek, partly because you have it's Montezuma Creek and Bluff, Utah are both primarily Mormon communities. One happens to be a group of Native American Mormons. The other tends to be, so we haven't seen it develop in this specific, but I would expect that, especially as you move towards the Colorado side. I know some of the chapter houses there have had this open discussion about how to deal with it. But I would expect that that could well be going on. I don't have any empirical on that, but based on sort of the way things function, I would expect it to be going on.
Thank you. One of our hopes was that somehow through the public choice lens that we could identify existing social capital and try to harbor that as a proxy to develop these informal institutions that are not there to support entrepreneurs. What do you think about that hypothesis?
So that's the hypothesis that we largely ran on the other side of this project, which was we were trying to develop some of that through some entrepreneurship mentoring and classes, and trying to identify were there ways. The single best way we found was what was consistent was the LDS Church, the Mormons operate it's essentially they refer to it as employment training, but essentially in lots of these rural areas, it's training in how to start and open a business. And where we saw the most success was where folks were linked with both that program and with some of the training that we were doing. And so I think there are some civil society type things that could be developed that would be helpful, but the formal institutions, particularly those from BIA, create such a strong fence, especially on the Navajo Nation. And it's true to varying degrees with different reservations. For whatever reason, the Navajo got a particularly bad deal with the BIA. The BIA is in charge of almost everything. And so those fences end up making it very difficult for anything other than very small scale things to develop. And so part of what's happened, especially on Navajo Nation, if you've seen a huge percentage of young people leave the reservation altogether and never return. And so you have an aging population, and then those that can't identify a way to leave end up staying. They tend to be they tend to have lower educational outcomes and those sorts of things. And so you end up with a problematic self-reinforcing going on over and over again. So I'm hopeful that there's got to be a public choice approach that can help us harness civil society. I can't say that we found it, but that's the working hypothesis I still would have. I haven't come up with what that might look like. We should ask Jordan that question. He might have a better idea.
Brian, this might be a little off topic. I'm not really sure, but you mentioned that one of the barriers to entry is that they can't secure the land for the businesses. But what about what we're seeing oftentimes sometimes in the Hispanic community, but just kind of overall this mobile markets? We see more food trucks and also some innovative mobile markets for clothing, for houseware items. And so then you're not locked to a land. It is still, you have to have permission to park it on certain lands, and there might be some lands that they could designate for that. I'm not really sure about all of that piece, but.
Yeah, so that's an important piece. And the mobile has, it has, I think, helped to eliminate one of the pressure points, but it doesn't eliminate the other set of pressure points, which are the business registration points. And so while that mobile approach can eliminate the need to be able to lease, to figure out how to get the physical location, it doesn't change the requirement to figure out how to navigate the business registration side. And so what we see in practice is we see the burrito people. We see folks that they're operating a business out of a set of minivans where they're selling really great burritos, but they're not doing it as registered businesses, and so they struggle to build capital that can then be reinvested. And so you end up with very little employment gains from those sort of things, which are one of the things we would hope to see from increased entrepreneurship, would be that businesses aren't just supporting a single individual, although that's great, but that they would then also be able to build sufficient size to actually have employment going on as well. And that business registration side, I think really stands in the way of doing it. I think that the innovation on those mobile markets, I think that has a lot of potential, and I think we actually see a bunch of that going on. But there's still this set of institutions that hamper the ability for those things to grow substantially.
And where is the closest SBDC that could possibly help with this type of assistance for the business licensing, et cetera?
For the Navajo Nation?
Yes.
Periodically, there's one open in Montezuma Creek. It is inconsistent and entirely dependent on whether or not funds are given. In the middle of this project, they actually shut down the Montezuma Creek, and then it reopened. The consistent is in Window Rock, which is about 3 hours distant. But occasionally it's open there as well.
Theoretically speaking, Ryan, couldn't this be an opportunity for chapters of the Navajo Nation to exhibit civil regulatory authority? I mean, in an ideal world, they could take advantage of the bureaucracies of any of the four corner states and loosen regulations to try to create training and development and access to capital. What do you think about that?
They could. There's one major problem with that, and that is that chapter houses in the Navajo arrangement, chapter houses don't have necessarily full autonomy. They are not necessarily in a position to be able to do that. There tends to be relatively strong central control in the Navajo Nation, and so I think that that would be an opportunity that if you could identify some wedge places where that autonomy could exist, or where the Navajo Constitution is silent on it, you could create some wedge, and that would be possible. But for example, all of the funding is centralized through Window Rock, and not chapter houses have relatively little control on those sorts of things. But it would be potentially an opportunity to do that. And in terms of things like, for example, the Central Navajo government has done something similar to that on oil development, where they have oil lands both in Utah and in Colorado and a few in Arizona. And they've leveraged development in places where they could identify the institutional arrangements with those states that could assist. But it was relatively small scale. The other piece, the other part of it that gets complicated is there's still relatively high levels of corruption inside the Navajo Council, and it remains a huge problem, where instances of graft still happen with relative frequency inside. It's less now than it was 15 years ago, but it's still happening at a relatively high level, and so that makes that compounds some of the issues that happens.
Unfortunately, that's part of what the lens of public choice tells us, right? That's
Yep.
what drives the economics there.
Yep.
And that's unfortunately across the board, whether or not they are Indian Reorganization Act tribes or constitutional tribes like Navajo Nation, but it's even more rampant with the IRA tribes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the single biggest predictor is if you were given a leased property was, were you related to a member of Central Council? We did some statistical analysis. It was never good enough, I thought, to publish, but we've at least found correlations that were fairly strong between those things. And so, yeah, I think public choice does predict exactly that. So there was a question about what developments and policy are happening at the federal level. I might be in a bubble, but it seems like there are some obvious forms needed. Why are they not happening? Well, almost nothing is being developed useful at the federal level at the moment in terms of these questions. Why are they not happening? Well, I think public choice has a lot of answers to that. These are not places where there's a lot of incentive in terms of the self-interest of politicians, particularly getting involved in these sorts of fights in the 4 states where the Navajo Nation is. There's no upside for elected officials, particularly congressional representatives or the senators, to get involved, because it's all cost and no benefit politically. It just doesn't. There's nothing pushing. There are, however, some local changes that are happening in terms of the political arrangements. San Juan County now has a majority Navajo County Commission, which has now then been putting additional pressure on representatives from that area in an attempt to get some things moving. And so until we see additional, I think, political push for it, you are not likely to see lots of things happen at the federal level. Native American policy in the United States has long suffered from this problem.
Ryan, what about a lot of the trends towards people moving off of the reservation? I know that with one of my tribes, as much as 65%, including myself, live in urban areas. Is that another direction to look into?
I think so. I think so. I think that's I think it's happening fairly dramatically. If you look even at the Navajo Nation, you see lots of essentially, like many rural areas, although much more at a much larger level, you don't see folks staying on these reservation lands. They're leaving for opportunity. I think there's some public choice questions and implications there that are worth looking at. And in part, for me, one of the questions that I think comes up over and over again is when we talk about, so federal policy always wants to talk about sovereignty without ever giving any actual sovereignty. And so you end up with lots of restrictions on what the policy choice set looks like. And so many of the things that might be done that are off the table because of the way in which the federal regulations are structured. And so I think there's some interesting questions, particularly if you look at tribes where you've seen a lot of this. There might be some implications there. I'd have to think a little bit more about what sort of the research question would be in that area, although it sounds like you have in some detail.
Ryan, what is the infrastructure there as far as internet capabilities? And the reason I ask that is because when rural Nebraska was having a lot of drain, same kind of thing happening with small town Nebraska. Part of that was obviously job opportunities, and the internet was able to turn a little bit of that around and allow them to stay in their hometowns and have that quality of life. And still be able to have a viable income. So what is their infrastructure like in that respect?
So internet infrastructure in particular, there are really two answers to that question. On the one hand, if you pull like the standard maps of internet connectivity, particularly those, if you pull any of like the fiber maps up, you'll see that these are areas that are black holes. What has happened across lots of rural Utah in particular, and this is another area that I've done some study in, is that there has been the development of fixed point radio internet that gets speeds up to 6 or 8 down, which is functional internet. But it turns out when you look at, I did a project where we were looking at broadband penetration, and the one place where we didn't, because in Utah we found no difference in terms of people's perception of access, in terms of that, of getting the federal definition of high-speed internet. The one place where we did see a difference was on reservation lands, and so there clearly is something going on there. But I'm not certain it's because there's a lack of availability there may not be, particularly in a place like Montezuma Creek, which is in the same sort of geographic area as Bluff, and Bluff is primarily serviced by these fixed point radio antenna internet providers. And so the question for me is it an infrastructure question or is it an access question? And I think it's much more an access question about how do you engage with folks that that might be able to that might have an interest in it and show them the availability. So we actually don't know the answer to that. We don't really know the answer to that question at a very detailed level.
Right. Well, we've reached 1:05. Thank you so much, Dr. Yonk, for coming in and enlightening us with kind of your research on this topic. It's kind of dismal, but I think it's kind of very eye-opening, and hopefully it inspires a lot of research from II students and those who have kind of tuned in. So thank you so much once again, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day. And I guess, can I share your email if anyone has any questions?
Oh, absolutely,
Perfect.
please.
So if you have any further questions, I'll send over the email. Reach out to me as well. Follow us on Facebook, and yeah, have a great rest of the day.